Hello everyone. Before I introduce our speaker for today, I request you all to mute your audios and keep the videos off for the seamless flow of the talk. We have Dr. Anand Vaidya amongst us. He is a professor of philosophy at San Jose State University in Northern California and is also an occasional director of the Center of Comparative Philosophy. His primary area of research include comparative philosophy, the epistemology of necessity, possibility, and essence, and also the role of critical thinking in democracy. His recent article titled Intuition and Modality, a disjunctive social account of intuitional based justification and epistemology of modality was published in the Routledge Handbook of Modality. We'll share a link to his institutional profile and website on the chat. Please feel free to check it. Today, Dr. Vaidya will be talking to us about how convergence of analytic, comparative, and experimental philosophy could form a kind of bidirectional public philosophy. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Vaidya, and over to you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very
Yeah.
much.
Yeah. Yeah, just 1 minute, Professor
Yeah, sure.
Vaidya. Before you begin, in fact, I thought I would try to talk about the event as such for a few minutes before Jayshree introduces you. But anyway, let me do that at least now. Namaste, friends. Professor Anand Vaidya and other friends who have joined us today. I warm welcome to all of you. This event is being organized by Academic Support Cell of Department of Philosophy, University of Delhi. This Academic Support Cell is a very interesting and innovative kind of enterprise that has come into existence last year. It wants to, or it aims to help all the research scholars and the staff with regard to the research skills and any other thing related to the academic activity. So it has been supporting the research scholars, and it has been supporting the teachers who are in the colleges, and also the students, MA students and undergraduate students as well. So in this regard, one of the primary concerns that has come forward to us is how to deal with this methodologies in philosophy. So we thought of organizing a workshop on philosophical methodologies, and we also thought of a lot of possibilities of enriching ourselves with various kinds of methodologies that are existent, and how do we place them even. Okay, even if there is a methodology that is existent, it's not that you have to adopt it as it is. No, you can creatively engage with that, and you can come out with your own kind of methodology. So with that in our mind, we thought we would have monthly or weekly sessions, at least monthly sessions initially, to have an exposure to the scholars who have been working in this area, and we thought we would invite them here and interact with us and have a dialogue with us. It's more like it is not conceived in the form of a presentation and that's all. No, it was not conceived that way. We thought we would take up certain theme, and also we would pick up an article or a book and have a dialogue with the author and what kind of methodology that he has thought, so that it would be an enriching experience to both the author and as well as the students and the research scholars or the participants. So that's how we thought this would be a very interesting enterprise. And we last time when I was interacting with Anand on email, I found his web link, and I found that he wrote 4 or 5 articles on methodology. So I thought he's the best person. In fact, we are inaugurating this research methodology series with Professor Anand Vaidya. So I think that's a wonderful thing that we are doing with your support, Anand. I'm so happy that you're the first one, and we are beginning with Anand, the bliss. So I'm sure we would go further and have wonderful exposure to various methodologies that are existent. Having said that, no, why should we bother about the methodologies? often we come across, like being in a non-Western part of the world, often we find that the place of Indian philosophy or non-Western philosophies in the Western world seem to be marginalized or slightly misplaced. No, I don't want to use the negative words, but still, you have to take recourse to such kind of terminology. So, given that kind of status, and given that the comparative philosophy initially how it has evolved had certain limitations that have come up, and in fact some of the scholars have even announced the death of comparative philosophy. It went on to that extent, and again it rejuvenated itself, and it is coming up in various different forms. And one of the wonderful forms is being presented by Anand in the form of public philosophy. So I thought that's a very interesting kind of enterprise that he is trying to bring out, and it would be really enriching to listen to Anand and also interact with him. So I welcome Anand for this workshop or whatever interactive session that we have today. So please go ahead, Anand.
Okay.
We will have a session of 20 to 30 minutes, whatever you think for the presentation, and we'll have a major chunk of time for discussion. And we with this for this purpose, in fact, we have requested some of our colleagues. We have circulated the paper that you have sent us, Anand. We have circulated to all the students and other friends. And some of the students have come forward as a core group. They read the article together and they thought they can have a discussion with you. So over to you, Anand.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, good. I think everyone can hear me well and see me well, and that the PDF version of the slides has been handed out, which makes things easier for me to present. The paper that was distributed can be accessed on my website. If you don't have it, you can just go there and download it. It is actually called Public Philosophy, Cross-Cultural and Multidisciplinary. And the paper was written a while ago, and it's the primary basis for my talk. However, there are 3 new papers related and building off of that initial paper that just came out. One of them came out just, I think, a couple of months ago. The talk for today is based on that initial paper, but I'm going to actually close with something different and new so that you can see something being developed further in my thinking. And in addition, I'm going to make this very straightforward and basic in the presentation so that we can talk about the idea. So the people who have read the paper should be able to engage more deeply with me about the paper if they like to. And for those of you who haven't read the paper, hopefully the way in which I make the presentation very straightforward about what I'm talking about, you will be able to see what's going on and ask questions if you're interested. Having said that, let me just begin then, okay? So the title is Public Philosophy, Cross-Cultural and Multidisciplinary, and I will explain roughly what that means and where I'm going with that idea. So the first place to begin is with this idea that there are 2 kinds of public philosophy. In the way in which I conceive things, the 2 types are sort of individuated or made different by the way in which we look at how the philosopher is engaging with the public. So the first direction is the common one. It's called the philosophy to public direction of fit. And a good example of that is the work of Michael Sandel at Harvard University, who actually has written a book called Public Philosophy. And a lot of what he does is he takes an important concept or idea that we need to discuss socially, and he talks about how philosophers like John Rawls have analyzed the problem and how multiple philosophers from Aristotle to John Rawls engage the problem. So one of the issues he talks about is many of you in India stand in a queue for a long time. You stand in a line for a long time. And one of the problems he analyzed at one time is whether or not it's ethically permissible to pay someone else to stand in the queue for you because it takes so long to stand in a queue, right? So this is the idea of having someone stand in the queue for you and you jumping in. And what's the ethics of that? So that's like a public problem. People get annoyed standing in lines. And then Michael Sandel comes along and gives an analysis of it. So that's the more common philosophy to public direction of fit. The one that I try to distinguish from that is the public to philosophy direction of fit. And the important idea here is that a philosopher is not playing the role of analyzing first, rather they're playing the role of listening first. The idea is that a philosopher listens in the public sphere to identify problems that may not already exist in philosophy and maybe even theories that we don't even have to develop theories and develop new problems. So the public to philosophy direction of FIT is where it's kind of like someone listening more than writing, and listening in order to figure out what to talk about and maybe new ways to talk about it. Okay, so I'm interested in both of these directions. I'm not saying that one is superior than the other. I think what Michael Sandel does falls under the first one very easily, and it's more common. It's very useful. It's very important. It should never go away. But I think the other direction is something that's less explored and something that we could spend more time as philosophers trying to do. Now, what's the relationship of this to a more broad topic that my introductor presented about what I was doing? Is that public philosophy has not been part of the background of comparative philosophy in the 20th century at all, from my understanding. So what I was trying to do in my paper was to introduce the idea that we might want to make comparative philosophy go the direction of public philosophy, to see if we can use the resources of comparative philosophy to build out public philosophy in one or both of these ways. Okay, so that's connection. I'm going to come back to this at the very end of my talk, but for now, the main thing is I just want to make sure you have in mind the two different things. Okay, now on to the basic component. So there are three philosophical methodologies that I want to talk about. In saying that there are three methodologies, I am not saying that they're the most important and that they're the only ones. That would be really a bad idea. However, I do want to signal that I am talking about these three methodologies. If you have questions about what I think about other methodologies, I have lots to say about them, but for now I'm talking about these three. So the first kind of methodology is the analytical methodology that is common from 20th century analytical philosophy as it's practiced in the West. And the primary aim, I think, of this type of philosophy is to engage in what is known as a priori conceptual analysis. And that means that we take thought experiments about concrete cases, such as the nature of justification, knowledge, truth, reference, and we analyze these cases and we attempt to come up with conditional statements that tell us either completely what a concept picks out or partially what a concept picks out. Usually this is done in English, although it could be done in German. But the typical idea is that because it's pursued mostly in Western philosophy departments that are speaking English and practicing in English philosophy, it's mostly done in English. But the primary idea is that a person can analyze a case and come up with some sort of a priori justification. Now, what does that really mean here? That's something we can go into in discussion, but it basically means that they can arrive at some sort of justification for believing that their conceptual analysis is correct simply based on thinking about the concept in their head. That's basically what we're going to mean for now. If you want to go into technical details about what I think about a priori knowledge, happy to do so. But for now, that's the basic idea. So the analytic method is basically the a priori method of conceptual analysis. What's the most common example? If you don't already know this one, I'll walk you through it. The most common one had to do with the analysis of knowledge, where Western philosophers for a long time had tried to analyze knowledge as justified true belief. And Edmund Gettier came along and potentially showed that that analysis doesn't hold. And the way in which he did that was by considering the conditional: if X has a justified true belief that P, then X knows that P. So if knowledge just is justified true belief, then this conditional should hold. He basically went through and he showed that there are examples. We can go through this in detail if you want to, but basically that there are examples that show that this conditional fails. So for example, one of the most famous ones from the paper is that there's a man going to get a job interview. This person is Jones. There's another man going to get a job interview, Smith. And Smith comes to believe the first statement, that Jones is the man who will get the job and that Jones has 10 coins in his pocket. Why? Because he saw Jones counting 10 coins at the job interview office when they were sitting out front. And basically from this, he infers the following sentence. Number 2, the man who will get the job has 10 coins in his pocket. Now, because of some principles called closure and fallibility, he can come to the conclusion that he has a justified true belief that the man who will get the job has 10 coins in his pocket, but unbeknownst to him, he's the one who's going to get the job. And in fact, he has 10 coins in his pocket. So the idea is somehow that his justification and the fact that he believes something has separated from the thing that makes it true. So he's the person who makes true the statement that the man who has 10 coins in his pocket will get the job. And in fact, his belief is about this other person, Jones, who we saw go into the interview office and saw him counting 10 coins and putting them in his pocket. So the belief and the justification separated from the truth. So you have a case of justified true belief, but because of this separation, it seems like Smith doesn't know who's going to get the job. Okay, so this is a very common example that's used. This sort of technique is used in analytic philosophy a lot. If you're unfamiliar with it, we can talk about it in more detail. But the key idea is that there's a case, the case is presented, then some people argue about the conditions under how the case should be analyzed. They generate a conditional statement. They try to falsify the conditional statement through a counterexample. And basically this goes on and on and on. And I just want to point one thing out because I'm speaking to an audience of people working in philosophy in India. Clearly, analytic philosophy is not done only in the West. It's obviously done in Indian philosophy like crazy. If you read Gangesha, you'll read lots of stuff on Indian examples of counterexamples and stuff like that. So it's a very common methodology. It's just being called analytic because of what we're referring to here. Okay, so let's go to the next one. The next kind of philosophy is a rather new style of philosophy, according to some people, that came about roughly in, I would say, like the early 2000s, but around the late 90s, and maybe had some precursors in the early 90s and the late 80s. It might even have some roots in feminist philosophy. I've actually done some research where I think you can find roots for experimental philosophy in feminist philosophy. So it has some prior roots.
Anand,
but the real, yes?
May I interrupt 1 minute? Actually,
Sure.
you said there is a presentation, right? I'm not seeing any presentation. Did you start the slides?
I gave you
Actually,
the
we
PDF.
we have shared it with everyone, sir, because he wanted to sort of see the audience. So we have shared it on the link, like we have shared it on the chat, so everyone can download it. It's free, openly
So
available.
if you're looking at the PDF, I'm on page 6 basically, and I'm just going sequentially down the slides. I hope that works because this way I at least can see you. Otherwise, it's a bit too difficult for me to do this.
Great.
Okay.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry to interrupt. Yeah, please go ahead.
Oh, yeah, no problem. So I'm on page 6, by the way, but maybe it'll be useful. I'll call out the page numbers. Okay, so experimental philosophy is it's a newer kind of philosophy, let's say, at least in the way in which it's being defined these days, but it primarily engages in what I would call a posteriori conceptual analysis. That's at least one of the important strands of experimental philosophy. And one of the points of what they're trying to do is use the methodology of social psychology that uses survey methodologies in order to see whether concepts such as knowledge are universal or variant across different cultures. And what they oftentimes do is create a thought experiment and then use the thought experiment in different cultures under various translations of it in different languages to see whether or not there's cultural variation about how people in different cultures who speak different languages think about the thought experiment. So if the a priori analytic approach is to think about it in your head, alone, in a room, in one language, then the experimental method is to think about it by looking at different cultures and different speakers and different languages. But what is the object through which this is done? It's done, again, through a thought experiment. So here's one from a very famous paper in 2001. Bob has a friend, Jill, who has driven a Buick for many years. Bob therefore thinks that Jill drives an American car. He's not aware, however, that her Buick has recently been stolen, and he is also not aware that Jill has replaced it with a Pontiac, which is a different kind of American car. Does Bob really know that Jill drives an American car, or does he only believe it? So basically, this is another Gettier type of example. It's just written with different example components, but it's the same structural thing. There's this idea that basically the thing that makes the statement true has separated from the source of justification that supports the belief. So when truth separates from justification and belief, it looks like a person might simply believe it only, but the question is, do they really know it? And it looks like, according to their original study, so this is what they said, they found some very interesting results. And I'll read what it says on page 8. The striking finding in this case is that a large majority of Westerners give the standard answer in the philosophical literature, that the person only believes. But among East Asians, the pattern is actually reversed. A majority of East Asians say that Bob really knows. Okay, so after finding the extraordinary differences between Westerners and East Asians on the Gettier case, we thought it might be interesting to analyze the Indian subcontinent's data as well. We were right. It turns out that the epistemic intuitions of SCs are even more, subcontinentals, are even more different from the intuitions of Westerners than the intuitions of East Asians are. If these results are robust, then it seems that what counts as knowledge on the banks of the Ganges does not count as knowledge on the banks of the Mississippi. All right, this is a very famous claim. I was in graduate school when this came out. It boggled my mind, being an American-born Indian. I was like, oh, what kind of intuitions do I have? Where do I fall on this map? I mean, who do I count as? I mean, how does the intuitions I have say where I might come from, actually? So, so I spent a lot of time thinking about this and studying it and thinking about it more. And it turns out that many, many years later, roughly in, I think, 2015, they did another study and they came up with a different response. This time they said the following: we have provided evidence that the Gettier intuition is universal, removing one of the crucial bits of evidence for the cross-cultural challenge to the role of intuitions in philosophy. That said, at this point, we should refrain from dismissing this challenge too quickly. Further evidence could show that the Gettier intuition does vary across cultures. Furthermore, we have provided evidence that people across cultures share a core folk epistemology, just as they share a folk physics or a folk biology. Furthermore, we have identified a possible component of this core folk epistemology. It is plausible that across languages, the word that is used to translate to know refers to a property speakers distinguish from the possession of a mere justified true belief. Good. So this is a follow-up study. It had a better probe. That's the element you use to test the population, the probe. It had a better probe and a better set of controls, a better set of questions, better statistical analysis. It was just done in a more rigorous way, following the methodology of social psychology better, doing better controlled studies in more places around the world. It was well done, and they had a different result. But this is actually just showing you the issue. So in the experimental method, we use a very straightforward scientific social psychology approach. It's a very good thing to use, and we test it in various populations. And what we do is we might find out that, hey, one time the result came out this way, 10 years with a better study comes out another way, and they're even granting that if we do further research, it might come out differently. And that's the scientific method. It's open to revision upon better analysis and better experimentation. That's the way we should be looking at it. Now, this is just a different way of doing things. The person who is sitting in their chair at Oxford University thinking in their head about the analysis of knowledge, while someone else at the University of Delhi is sitting and thinking about jnana and the analysis of it in Sanskrit, are doing the same thing. They're doing a priori conceptual analysis in different languages in their own little offices, and that's perfectly okay, and that's been part of philosophy in every culture as far as I've seen over the last 20 years of doing global philosophy. So I think it's going on everywhere, and it's perfectly okay. The experimental method is just another method, okay? So let's go forward from there. So now I'm on page 10. Good. And I think we're doing good for time, so I'll have a lot of time for discussion. So page 10. So this is another type of philosophy, and it's interesting to me that comparative philosophy has been around for a very, very long time. Arguably, it has a much longer history than the origination of analytical philosophy as understood as deriving from the work of at least Frege going forward, if not earlier, to someone like Bolzano. Let's maybe just say from Bolzano forward, through Frege, Russell, Wittgenstein, the classic people, up through the ordinary language philosophical movement, up through, you know, contemporary research that goes on in various parts of America, Germany, and England. Arguably, comparative philosophy has been going on for a lot longer than this. And it's definitely been going on longer than experimental philosophy. Even if we trace experimental philosophy back to ordinary language philosophy, or as I think you can find roots of it in feminist philosophy. I think there's a very big claim to be made that it can be found in feminist philosophy. So let's look a little bit here now at what's going on. So in comparative philosophy, I'm going to give a couple of different definitions, but at least one is that the idea is that we look, for example, at Gangesha, who's an amazing Nyaya, 13th Navya Nyaya philosopher, 13th century Navya Nyaya philosopher. And we look at Gangesha in relation to someone like Gettier, and we compare what Gangesha might have thought about something with something what Gettier thought about. We want to be historically accurate about what Gangesha said, and we want to be historically accurate about what Gettier said. and the goal might be to just illuminate the different ways in which they see something. It might be to talk about who has a better method in their argument, sorry, a better argument for what they're doing. We might want to just showcase, we might want to say who's better. There's a lot of things that comparative philosophers do. I don't want to say that there's just one thing, but I do want to bring out that basically, if you're in the comparative framework, one thing that's really central is that it's historically informed. That means it requires textual accuracy, literacy in the language of the philosophers, and historical knowledge of the context in which the discussion was had. And that's a really important central component of doing comparative philosophy. So let's talk a little bit about what there are different ways of doing comparative philosophy. So comparative philosophy is done in different ways. I think that there's this older version I've been talking about that's very historically informed. And then there's another one that came about primarily through the work, I think, of contemporary Buddhist philosophers working in America, like Mark Sideritz. So there's something called fusion philosophy, which is the outgrowth of the work largely of two people who worked with Karl Popper back in the day, Mark Sideritz and Arindam Chakrabarty. And basically, I think fusion philosophy aims to basically say, hey, why don't we try to fuse philosophical systems together? Let's try to fuse philosophical ideas together. And one time I heard that the analogy for this is to think about like fusion food. So if you like fusion food, some people don't like fusion food, but if you like fusion food like Indo-Chinese food, I mean, that's a big rage sometimes, mixing Indian food and Chinese food, then you can think of fusion philosophy as the equivalent of mixing philosophical systems together. I personally do not like this analogy. And the reason why is because I don't think that what we're doing with food is the same thing that we're doing with philosophy. So although there's mixing going on, the purposes of the mixing in food is different than the purposes of mixing in philosophy. One is evaluative and truth normed in the philosophy case. The other one is taste and aesthetically normed. And those norms are different. So what we're trying to do is completely different. The way in which I think of fusion philosophy now is under the model of what's come to be known as conceptual engineering, the project of engineering concepts in order to help solve social problems, for example. And conceptual engineering is an outgrowth of the work of Rudolf Carnap. So I think of fusion philosophy as one way to do conceptual engineering. And the basic idea is that you take philosophical concepts from different cultures and systems and you fuse them together to see if you can come up with a superior concept to serve some role for some problem you want to engage in. So I'm currently working on some research on what's known as cross-cultural conceptual engineering, a new framework for fusion philosophy. It breaks with the model that fusion philosophy is about mixing things together for food and goes more with the fusing things together in order to build something to solve a problem. It's also part of what I think is useful in the public to philosophy direction of fit. That is when a philosopher is listening to the public and notices there's a problem and maybe there's no concept from one system to help analyze that problem. They can use two different cultural systems, fuse a concept together, plop it down, and see if they can get a good analysis and some traction. So that's one place where I see that. Another way of doing comparative philosophy is what's known as constructive engagement. This was pioneered by my teacher and mentor at San Jose State, Bo Mu, who works in Chinese philosophy, who started the Center for Comparative Philosophy and also was the director before me of the Center for Comparative Philosophy. Constructive engagement is the model that says, let's delineate nicely each of these little traditions. Like, let's take, something like Advaita Vedanta philosophy and contemporary debates in analytic philosophy of mind on panpsychism, and let's force them to debate each other constructively to see what we get out of the debate. Do we get new ideas? Do we get new theories? Do we get better arguments? Can we adjudicate things? But the idea is to not just compare to say who's got what's similar, what's different. We don't want to just compare. The idea is we want to constructively engage to build something. So there's a relationship to the fusion idea, but it is different. It's a different model. And if you look at our journal, the Journal of Comparative Philosophy, Professor Mu has oftentimes argued for this sort of constructive engagement model, which is very good. Okay, so finally, there's another one which comes from the work of Max Weber and Arindam Chakrabarty. It's called Philosophy Without Borders. And basically, this is an idea that sort of is still in the comparative philosophy framework of saying that there are these different traditions, but what they're trying to do is they're trying to say, let's just drop the borders and start going across these different traditions and bringing things together. If anything, I would say comparative philosophy without borders is kind of like another model of fusion philosophy. It's not the model that I have. Mine is based more on the idea of what's going on in conceptual engineering done cross-culturally. But philosophy without borders is another model like fusion philosophy. So Mark Sideritz has the fusion philosophy with the food example. Arindam has comparative philosophy without borders. And constructive engagement is what you find in the work of Bo Mu. There are many other models of comparative philosophy, just as there are many other models of experimental philosophy and analytical philosophy. So we can talk about that if you want to. But I think you have an idea. So here's another example of, if you want to see what's going on, that I think is brilliant. On page 11, we can look at the work of Jay Shaw, who's another teacher of mine in New Zealand. He's written a great work called The Concept of Knowledge, East and West. It came out in basically 2000, a year before Stephen Stitch and Weinberg and Sean Nichols published their paper. I think it's a great work. It basically discusses the Gettier problem across Indian philosophy and Western philosophy in detail. And it has a lot of interesting papers that, if one had read back then, it would have been very enlightening to study. And so this is one model of comparative philosophy. He brings people together and has them come to the Ramakrishna Mission in Kolkata, and we all discuss together various problems. I was recently there just in January of this year, before the pandemic, started doing more research in this paradigm. But there's another one that people know about. It's called the Samba Technique. It was introduced with Daya Krishna and Arindam Chakrabarti, and it's basically where people who speak two different languages, such as a Sanskrit pundit and a Western analytic philosopher, debate an issue across their two language systems with one person in the middle translating. So in this case, Arindam Chakrabarti translated between an Oxford philosopher and some Sanskrit pundits, and basically what they were doing was debating the idea of whether or not there is a concept of a proposition inside of the Navya Nyaya system, and its importance in Russellian and Phrygian theories of meaning. It's a deep problem in philosophy of language in the West, and I think the discovery was basically that there is no concept of propositions in Navya Nyaya. At least that's my recollection. If I'm wrong about that, I apologize. All right, so that's sort of like the three models. Now, what's been going on though? This is a huge debate. Like, okay, so everybody in philosophy wants to debate who's right, I'm right. So, so Edouard Macheray wrote this brilliant book that I'm reading again, and it's called Philosophy Within Its Proper Bounds, and it's a big defense of experimental philosophy. Of course, it has a lot of changes from what initially happened in the early years, but it's really a wonderful book. I highly suggest, if you're interested in experimental philosophy, to read this book. If you're interested in philosophical methodology, I would say read this book. But I would also tell you to read Timothy Williamson's The Philosophy of Philosophy. He's another scholar I work with at Oxford University. His research is amazing and outstanding. It's two great books that you can read, but you wouldn't be done in Anand's book unless you read the third one, Comparative Philosophy Without Borders by, Ralph Weber, not Max Weber, and Arindam Chakrabarti. If you read that book, I think you put these three together and you're like, wow, that's a really great way to learn about philosophical methodologies in a very contemporary way, because these are all books that were written after 2000, and they're all very, very, very good. So it's a good way. But at least part of what I see when I look at this stuff is like some kind of debate. Like, okay, you should go this way, you should go this way, you should go this way. And, Anand just basically is not like that. Anand's view is don't go any of those one ways alone. Go to page 13. So the way I've been looking at things for 20 years now, as I've been traveling around the world and studying with each of these groups for at least 7 years, I was trained as an analytic philosopher, working in the philosophy of modality primarily and modal logic. And I worked with a very prominent analytic epistemologist named Anthony Bruckner, who has worked heavily in the analytical tradition. But then I spent time working with experimental philosophers for 7 years, understanding what they were doing and trying to learn more from them. But then at a certain point in time, I became confused as to why we weren't studying the history of these different traditions. It's not like we just want to test out what Indians think about the word knowledge in Hindi circa 2008. We might want to know what Indian philosophers actually wrote in the 13th century. So I studied comparative philosophy for a decade, primarily working on the Navya Nyaya tradition. That's primarily where I focus on, as well as Advaita Vedanta and consciousness studies, and some work in Mimamsa. But basically, I've been working around for 20, 21 years in all these traditions, and I think the best thing to do is actually to put them together. I think the unified account is a much better than any one alone. So if I say I like all three, am I saying that any one alone is bad? No. I'm saying each one might have its own utility and refined purpose, but unifying them, I think, is a superior product than any one of them alone. So I think you should have something like analytic philosophy with comparative philosophy and experimental philosophy. And if you go to slide 15, I can explain what that means. So here, analytical philosophy will no longer mean just the British tradition. It will mean anybody who's engaged in analyzing a concept. So that means all of a sudden that philosophers in the Navya tradition who were thinking about jnana and prama, the prama debates that are so prominent, the pramana debates between the Buddhists and the Nyaya philosophers, it's so important. And they were all giving arguments and analyzing concepts like pramana, what is reliable warrant. And so they count as analytic philosophers in the sense in which I'm talking about. And so it's very important that we look at analytical thinking across different traditions because it is there across different traditions. Importantly, on page 15. Then the comparative philosophy, I think, is important also because we want to actually historically look at what these different traditions said. I think if we had read Jay Shaw's book on concepts of knowledge, East and West, which was actually a conference in 1996, and that had informed the work of Stephen Stitch, Jonathan Weinberg, and Sean Nichols before they wrote their paper on the Gettier thought experiment in 2001, well, we would have had a way more interesting discussion, in my opinion. It would have been wrong for them to publish what they did at the time, but I think we could have included this work that was already there and had some very interesting answers to the Gettier problem from the perspective of the Navya Nyaya tradition, and we could have learned a lot and it would have been better. So I like comparative philosophy mixed in with analytic because I like the history guiding the analysis. And then, of course, I think you have to empirically anchor. I think you need to experimentally anchor on actual things that people are saying and doing and thinking nowadays, as well as because I think of experimental philosophy as also involving cognitive neuroscience. I think it's very important. And also most experimental philosophers think that experimental philosophy is not just the methodology of the social psychology survey methodology, but also involves heavy use of neuroscience, cognitive neuroscience, and different models of the mind. So I definitely am in favor of that. I think that's a way better way to approach the thing. And I think when you put all of those three together, you get a way better product. So that's the methodology I produced. I called it the ACE methodology for analytic, comparative, and experimental. I think those are the three dimensions. Analysis of concepts is necessary for experimentation, and historical backing just makes your analysis of concepts better. So that's the way I look at it. Okay, so you might think, okay, Anand, so what do you do with all of this? Well, here, I will tell you about a new project I'm working on, and I'll close there. So the new project is called, it's on page 16. It's basically a project on the epistemology of attention. I'm very much interested in attention. So what would be the analytic component? It would be to debate a priori analyses of attention and different kinds of attention supported by concrete cases through thought experiments. We need to figure out what are some good ways of analyzing attention in relationship to other concepts. Just like we analyze knowledge in relationship to justification, truth, and belief, we need to analyze attention. But secondly, we might need to look at how there is variation on attention across cultures, just as we looked at the variation on knowledge across cultures. Is there a uniform folk theory of attention across cultures, or does attention vary across cultures? I mean, we looked at the knowledge literature for 20 years and we had variation in 2001 and no variation in 2015. What about if we looked at the concept of attention in more detail? So I think that's good. And because I've been doing a lot of research through Janardhan Ganeri's work on attention, not self, as well as reading various Buddhist philosophers, I think there's a lot to learn from the history of how attention was used in areas like ethics, political philosophy, and epistemology. And so I'm very interested in us historically putting, so I think you can wrap these three things together and you can have a nice way of looking at the epistemology of attention that takes all three methodologies and finds benefits from each of them to make a nice braided theory. And where does I think that goes? That goes to the last thing, so the last thing I want to talk about is on page 17, and it's just the last point. And the last point is basically, so how does this relate to public philosophy? So I think that this is actually not the philosophy, the public direction of fit, nor is it the public to philosophy direction of fit. Rather, it's something that's the harmony of both working cyclically. Because if I was to tell you it's either or, I would just be working in a Western dichotomy way of thinking. I'm not an either or all the time person. I'm a both and sometimes person. So I'm kind of like a logical pluralist. So I'm like, it's either or sometimes. Well, other times it's both and also. So you can have that case. This is a both and case of my distinction. And it's actually just historically true, because what happened was I was listening to things going on in the world in social media, political argumentation, and thinking about how there's just a lack of attention to what other people are saying and what's going on. And maybe there's a connection between how we're engaged with social media and how that robs us of our attention or depletes attention and working memory in various ways. And I was thinking about it in democratic processes. And then at the same time, I was reading Buddhaghosa on attention, and I was thinking to myself, wow, this person has a lot of things to say, or Shantideva on attention. And I was thinking, wow, wouldn't it be great if we could like figure out how to put these things together in the epistemology of attention? And so that's an example of what I think we can do. We can put these things together to produce something that the world needs. Hopefully, that's at least what I think, some more attention on attention. And I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Vaidya. Thank you. So now we'll start the discussion session. So I'm going to request everyone to please use the chat box to please mention your questions. We have a lot of people, so we want to sort of, try to get to as many questions as possible. So I'm going to start with the first question, Dr. Vaidya. Can we start? Is that okay with you? Would you like to?
You can start whenever you want to, and I have extra time if needed.
Okay, so the first question is by our researcher Karamveer, and he wanted to get your opinion on a different way of looking at the issue of low representation of non-Western philosophies in mainstream academic philosophy. So as an alternative to the idea of inclusion in public philosophy, there can be the decentralization of academic institutional power, which is generally US-centric or Eurocentric. So we perhaps do not need to look at inclusion of canons in already dominant institutions, because it seems to start with the assumption that only that which is accepted by these central powers is philosophical. So do you look at it that way? Or what do you think about like the decentralization of such academic institutional powers for?
Yeah, so I'm pretty I'm aware of that completely. Like I've actually been in conversations with people on that issue at the University of Yale National University in Singapore. Actually, I had a conversation with some Indian philosophers there. I think that's actually legitimate. I don't have a problem with that. I mean, if the idea is that we want to talk about decentralizing rather than just including more, I think that's a very important point. It's kind of what already happens in philosophy without borders, because when you don't have borders, you can't talk of a center as easily, right? You can't say like, there's a center here. So I think that's a little bit of what happened. But I think I would add this to the question. I think this is a very important idea. So one time I was talking with a Canadian-trained Indian philosopher who said, well, maybe what might be interesting is to change the dominant questions of philosophy from those pursued by Western philosophers to some of the questions, for example, we find in Dharma Shastra, for example, right? The Dharma traditions, right? And so I was like, that's a really good point. I didn't think about things that way. So I'm not against that at all. I do think that that can happen. And actually, I didn't mention this part, but in my paper, when I talk about bidirectional testing in one of my later papers, I don't know if it's in the paper I sent you, the basic idea is that experimental philosophy has always tried to present Western thought experiments to Indian populations, for example, but they have never thought to present Indian examples to Western populations. That's the method of bidirectional testing that I've championed in a new paper I've written on the different pramanas. So actually, I believe both you can decentralize within experimental philosophy alone and analytic philosophy by changing the questions altogether. And also, in general, I think the decentralization movement is perfectly legitimate. And I guess the part of the question that was technically important was like, is there an opposition between inclusion and decentralization? That is, does the inclusion methodology somehow not decentralized? That's an interesting, actually, I think that's actually a problem in like topography, like looking at spatial orientation. I don't really know actually if that logically holds. I think you actually can include and decentralize at the same time, because if you include but drop all boundaries, maybe you don't anymore have a center. So inclusion can preclude decentralization if you have boundaries. But this seems like a math problem to me. I'm sure some mathematicians could figure out the relationship between inclusion and spatial relations and decentralization. That's my answer.
Okay, okay. By the way, people can start their videos even though you're requested to keep yourself on mute. We would love to see some faces in case it's suitable for your setup. So the next question. The next question has been raised by Yogeshwar, Karamjeet, Sujit, and me. It's about the idea of philosophy and how it can be sort of traced to originate and develop. So there has been a concern that when we were discussing that, there was a lack of mention of the social and political context of how the idea of philosophy is that which can be traced back to Plato or Aristotle, like how that idea in itself came to exist, because it seems to be intimately linked with the hegemonic rise of certain countries and their cultures, which also entail that the philosophy of these cultures came to be called mainstream and proper philosophy.
Yeah.
So could you share how such historical explanations might fit in with how you look at philosophy?
Oh, good. So first, I have to say that if you are interested in this question, which is a very important question, Brian Van Norden just wrote a great book about taking back philosophy. I think that this question is explored very well in what he's talking about. And there's another philosopher, Peter Park, who also has a book that discusses this stuff with respect to Kant. I think this is a very important question. How does this play in what I'm talking about in terms of, so I typically go with a different sort of like answer to the first part of the question. So the first part of the question is, how do we understand philosophy cross-culturally? And I kind of say, this is really going to be embarrassing, but I hope this answer is acceptable in a sense. So if someone tells me, look, Wasser is a German word, so there's only water or Wasser in Germany, I'd be like, that's a use-mention fallacy. I mean, we have another word called pani in Hindi, and that picks out water just fine. So I'm sorry. The mere analysis or the etymology or the historical trace of the philosophy word is not a good enough argument to say that what it picks out doesn't exist elsewhere. So that's my flat-footed, straightforward, just silencer for the first part of your question. I think that the fact is there's a cognitive activity. It is permeous. Doesn't have rigid boundaries, and that thing is going on. So, for example, let's look very carefully at one example. Pramana Shastra, which is a very important part of what's going on in the history of Indian philosophy through the Sanskritic traditions all the way up until, I would say, even the 20th century with the work of people like Bimal Krishna Motilal and Daya Krishna. This kind of work that's going on suggests to me that there is something that is in the province of epistemology. But is it epistemology? No, it's not. Are the questions of Pramana Shastra maybe more important than Western epistemology? Perhaps. That's how you relate it back to the first question. But I definitely think that there is some kind of relationship here between the things that gives sufficient overlap. So the first two parts of the answer are, one, there seems to be an easy way to block the idea that it only exists in the West. Number two, there's sufficient overlap. And now number three, the social, political, and hegemonic rise component. So there is a lot of stuff here that's really important about what is considered real philosophy as opposed to peripheral philosophy. And in my department, most of us are already on the view, I'd say 90% of the people in my department already accepted the idea that basically we are going to bring out philosophers from different traditions and change questions as we see fit. So I don't really work in a department where there is the kind of feeling that like it's only one tradition that does something. The political components of the history of this seem to me in my department to be like completely off the what we don't engage that idea so much. We engage more like, is there philosophy in the Maori tradition concerning personal identity? Yes, there is. Let's go figure out what it is, and let's bring out what it is, and let's show how it can engage Derek Parfit's work and Buddhaghosa, for example, or something like that. You see what I'm saying? Like, so the ethos of what I'm thinking is like, there's just interesting ideas out there, and it's a person who has a cultivated mind that cares to bring them out is going to bring them out, and they're exciting to all different types of people. Like I taught cross-cultural philosophy in Germany for one summer, and it was very interesting to discover that my Chinese students loved Descartes, and my one student from France loved Chinese philosophers. It was like, if you want to think there's a one-to-one mapping between cultural identity or professed cultural appearances and a philosophical tradition, you'll be falsified if you just teach an international global cross-cultural class in another part of the world. Right away, it'll just, like, everybody just goes different. They go where their heart lies. So there's no reason why not to bring out these other traditions. Okay, last part of the first question. There is a historical part of what you're saying, and the best thing for me to say is, although I'm aware of researchers who do work on the history of the hegemonic rise of these things, I am not an expert on that history. I can point you to people who are doing that work, but I would basically say that they're doing very important work. We need to read it and learn about it, but I'm not an expert on what they're saying. I'm more an expert in the technical components of how to blend things. So that's my answer to the second one.
Okay, so that sort of takes us smoothly to the next question, which has been asked by Arundhati and Sujit about how we can connect ACE framework or the larger points which you have raised in your paper to the on-the-ground social issues. So in countries that constitute the global south or third world or developing category, the central concerns are poverty, hunger, unemployment. And when you talked about cross-cultural concerns, search political, or, because we sort of focused on this paper, so search political and social issues were not mentioned, and the Gettier example seems to be largely of academic interest, which one could say does not really reach out to the real life issues. So is there any particular reason why you thought that, the public concerns, like it could have been in seemingly more academic terms, during the paper? So
yeah, good. So first of all, I don't think that actually. So the first thing is, I don't think the Gettier example has that thing. So one of the things that I thought about a lot is, what if we actually ran the Gettier example with something an Indian actually cared about? Let's take a fisherman in Kerala and the weather conditions and whether or not the fisherman was going to go out to fish that day. I think if you constructed a certain epistemological case that actually tracked the concerns of the population, you might find the question of whether or not he believes or does he really know to be important. Because what is the action related to that? Am I going to risk my life to go out and go fishing today? See, there is nothing in the standard Gettier example that ever puts anything at stake for the person. What's at stake for getting wrong, whether it's a Pontiac or Ford? Nothing. What's at stake for getting wrong, who gets the job? Nothing. The issue of knowledge is cut away from stake and action relevance. But in Indian epistemology and Pramana Shastra, we know one very important thing. A lot of these Navya Nyaya theories and Nyaya theories are about action. They're about action guidance, right? So maybe the problem is that we're constructing examples that you think from the Western paradigm really have no relevance to us. But do questions of knowing matter in India? Yes. Political processes. Are you going to vote for this person if you only believe, or does the person really know? Are you going to go out fishing if you're a villager and there's a big risk? So my first point is, don't be so quick to think that these examples don't work. The way they're constructed makes it seem like they don't. But I could construct examples and ways in which we can engage. But I think the second part of your question is more important. And I think the second part has to do with my distinction between two types of public philosophy. So one thing I think is a very important thing to do is to abandon altogether thinking that the philosophical questions coming out of any tradition are the ones that we might need to have salient in our mind. And instead, go out and listen to the people firsthand and figure out what are the problems that they're telling us they need help with. And then to construct new philosophy to deal with those problems, right? So if the idea was decentralization is a big thing, well, actually, in a way, for me, decentralization is a bit of an old move, right? Decentralization is part of a dialectic that's been going on about cultural imperialism for at least since independence in India, if not longer, as a story and thematic narrative. But decentralization, an important thing we still need to have our students understand, is not as important as thinking, are the problems going on in a specific area something for which people who are trained in philosophy can construct new philosophies for new problems, right? So I think sometimes this is hard to understand because there's this feeling that everything that's a problem now has always been a problem before. So how could there really be a new problem, right? And that's also another problem when you think about the framing of how you see things. When you go and listen to the public, and you're thinking about it, you've already been socialized to have a certain framework or schemata in your ear as you listen to things. So you're going to parse the information into something that's already in your mind. So there are two mechanisms, I think, that help to do this. One is to always work in public philosophy with a cross-cultural group. That guarantees that the schematas are not the same. Number two, work with people who have different trainings, right? Experimentally trained, analytically trained. Work with them to listen to the problems coming from the people, and then to think what really is the problem in their voice, what is the problem as we see it. So here's a way of thinking about it more broadly. Oftentimes I like to say self-knowledge is a social achievement. Self-knowledge is a social achievement. So what does that mean? That means sometimes figuring out what is going on with you is a matter of talking to others. But the same thing, thinking that there's a problem in your community might not necessarily be you just telling someone else what the problem is. It might be that group knowledge of what a problem is in the community is also a social achievement of talking with other people. So that's the analogy I would use. Now, is there, so you mentioned some stuff about poverty and hunger and these particular issues. So is there something like in philosophy that is automatically going to apply to these things? I mean, obviously, historically in India, the stuff that's been most relevant here has been stuff in the philosophy of economics. I mean, a lot of you live in Delhi, right? So, the Delhi School of Economics, I mean, obviously, and stuff. I did a lot of research on Amartya Sen's philosophy, and I taught seminars at my school. Obviously, a lot of that stuff is really where it's at. I think a lot of that stuff is more groundwork, or the work that Martha Nussbaum has done, for example, is very familiar to a lot of people in India. But I don't know if that's the end-all, be-all of it. I mean, I think a little bit of the question you're asking is there a way to go forward and actually build things out? In some sense, if you take one of your questions and put it together, it could be that maybe academic philosophers ought to adopt the questions of public concern in the way in which I described the public to philosophy direction of fit. Maybe it's time for them to stop thinking about certain problems and redirect their resources to other problems. I think I can develop more of an answer if I can hear more, but for now, that's the basis of what I would say.
Okay. Thank you so much for patiently answering. So the next question is also sort of, So in your paper, you had sort of talked about positive identity trajectory of how people enter into certain, groups, and, to include them and make them feel good, there has to be a sense. So I was wondering that, like when we are reading that, it seemed as if, like, isn't it important to sort of consider each philosophy as equally significant and rigorous in itself? And it's not because we want to make people who are entering the community feel good, but because these are inherently rigorous philosophical traditions. So how had you sort of thought about it while you're writing it?
I see what you're saying. I think you're saying, like, am I downplaying respecting the tradition in light of respecting the person? Right, or making the person feel good. Yeah, that's a really insightful thing. I don't think I actually had that in mind when I wrote that. So I don't think I want to make that mistake, because I don't think that these traditions are more or less rigorous. I think, if anything, the way in which rigor is understood is different, right? So it takes a lot of training to realize that when you read a passage in Sanskrit that's very terse and dense, it doesn't make it less rigorous. Rather, it makes it like a zip file on a computer, where you actually, when you really pound into it, it unzips a lot of information, but it's really tit and tersely. So it doesn't look like, the Critique of Pure Reason maybe, but it's got a lot in it. So I would think that rigor is what's variant, not that it's not rigorous. But there's another part to your question which has to do with this idea of a person feeling comfortable. I think part of that is that there is an element to that I am actually interested in. It's that sometimes it takes time, by listening to people in different groups, to let go of your own training enough where you can really have respect for their tradition. I don't think someone who's even been trained in Sanskritic philosophy their whole life can sit in a room at Oxford where people are doing analytic philosophy and really not explode inside in a deep way listening to it, unless I've spent a lot of time, I know for me, I spent 21 years listening to 3 different groups of people. The first time I listened to any of these groups, it was jarring like crazy. I was just like, it seems like this is like the worst thing I've ever heard. It's only now, after so long, that I'm like, wow, I can actually understand and feel the beauty and respect the people who work in these traditions and really like feel it, because I actually have spent so much time in embodying it and putting it in. So I do think there's a part of what I'm saying that has to do with the respecting the person part. So there's this idea where we let everyone sit at the table and then we just act and perform respect, but deep inside we don't really have the respect. And I want to say there's a little bit of like not just performing the respect, that's the inclusion, like everyone comes to the dinner party but only talks to the person next to them, but not to everyone else around the table. So I kind of want to like not have that. I want to have a little bit more. But thank you for pointing out this mistake. I definitely don't want to respect the rigor of other traditions, because I definitely feel that they are rigorous in these different ways.
Okay. So the next question is about the danger of sort of public philosophy being indistinguishable from comparative philosophy, which Shivani and I had sort of discussed. And we saw that this could happen in 2 ways. First, that the public, the audience that constitutes public, differs from one culture to another. And given that public philosophy in the ACE form might simply become a sophisticated form of comparative philosophy, because in ACE form, we hope to analyze concepts from varying philosophical traditions and empirically test them. And the second, that philosophical concepts which have been sort of clubbed under Western can also be sort of traced back to certain cultures, like the idea of knowledge as justified true belief. We could go to Plato, and we could say that it is a product of Greek culture. So what do you think of the possibility that all philosophical concepts could eventually be culture relative terms? Like, would philosophy also not be a family resemblance term then by that standard?
Well, yeah. So first of all, the answer to the question is philosophy sort of, as we're picking out these different things, more like a family resemblance term. Yeah, I think that's got to be right. I mean, it's definitely not. It's definitely not a classical concept. It could be prototypical. It could be like something that's like a weighted function prototype concept in that way. The second part, the other part about everything tracing back to Greek culture. Yeah, I think that the answer to that is basically to think like, look, let's go back to the example. So I teach a lot of classes in applied ethics, and a lot of applied ethics requires analyzing things in terms of what we call action-based analysis. I mean, there is agent-based ethics, like Aristotle and care ethics is agent-based, but action-based is basically, are you analyzing the intention or the consequence relation in Kantian ethics or utilitarianism? But is it really going to be the case that the Dharma traditions that are focusing on ethics are going to map onto that? No, they have different questions, right? And so it could be the case that a lot of what's going on by sticking and hanging on to those distinctions only is problematic. So actually, I find that some of applied ethics is problematic for me now, because I think a lot of the ethical issues that are explored in classical Indian philosophy are explored in a different way. They're not strictly going to factor into, is it duty-based, in the intention-based, or is it consequence-based? I don't think everything falls in that pattern. So I think if you push questions from different cultures about how to live a good life, then I think you will find actually that it's not going to all trace back to ancient Greece. So there is a little bit of like this sort of like, is there sufficient similarity at some point, and is there overlap? The question is, I mean, again, like when you're doing philosophy, oftentimes the question is, what do you want to do? So another part of your question was, who are you? Does the public, who are you talking to? So the question is, if you're a philosopher, you might want to ask yourself, who am I talking to, and what is the goal of my act of philosophizing, right? And remember here, the act of philosophizing isn't always the act of speaking. Otherwise, the Upanishads as a title would never even be the name of anything, because as I understand, Upanishad means to sit down and listen, right? So the act of philosophizing could be to sit down and listen, which is a kind of an odd idea to a lot of Western philosophers. I think philosophizing is standing up and giving some performance, right? But the part where you're sitting there and listening, that's not the philosophizing part, that's just the listening part. But obviously, to have a conversation philosophically requires listening and talking, so there's both there. So I think that actually you can philosophically engage with different groups of people if you think about what they want and what you're trying to give them philosophically. And there can be various different acts of philosophizing. Here's yet another one I think you should be very interested in. Recently, I've come across the idea that in certain ways of thinking about the history of Indian philosophy as a whole, it turns out that aesthetics is more central and like other parts of the philosophy. So if you took the philosophical thing, metaphysics, epistemology, political philosophy, social philosophy, aesthetics, you know, and you said these are terms now picking out different areas, you might think in Western philosophy the center is often metaphysics. But recently I've been talking to some people who say that aesthetics is the center in Indian philosophy. And in addition, when you think about aesthetics in Western philosophy, the most common prototype firing pattern is something like art. Usually when you use the term music, people are like, okay, music. But when you say aesthetics, they think art. They like visual arts. They don't think music, even though music is an aesthetic form also. But in classical Indian philosophy, it turns out that the most common aesthetic firing pattern is going to be Bharatanatyam, dance. And the actor-act distinction is central in aesthetics in India. And the actor-act distinction being central in aesthetics is central to understanding epistemology, right? And that, again, it changes the whole way in which you think about what's going on in Pramana Shastra, to think that the actor-act distinction might be central there. So I think just the cultural knowledge allows you to bring out for the audience something that's, you know, different. And it depends on what you're doing. So I definitely don't want to sound like I'm saying it's going to collapse all into just being Greek philosophy, that, you know, it's all just going to be some kind of comparative philosophy. I'm more interested in the idea that these are different tools, and that when you put them together, it's more it's more robust. It's a more robust narrative. But there's another part of your question that's very central here. Who am I talking to? So I'm talking right now to an academic audience. So I can talk about ace philosophy the way I did. However, was I giving a talk to a bunch of people on the street in Delhi? I don't know that I'd be using any of these vocabulary terms, because then I would just be not understandable, right? So mapping yourself to your audience just seems to be part of the game in general. That's not a problem for philosophy in particular. That's a problem for public speaking.
Okay. 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 So this is a question by Lewis Chartrand. I hope I will pronounce your name right, Lewis. I'm not sure. He says that I'm not sure it's such a good idea to merge it into a unified methodology. I think ACE, it seems to me that often research, much like other activities, is best served to specializing. Firstly, because some people can spend more time on some aspects of their specialization, but also because it lowers entry costs and enables, say, AI specialists or anthropology to come in, participate in a specialization, and bring their insight from their original discipline. So I think his question is, yeah, so that is what Lewis Chartrand has mentioned.
Samana, I'm going to cut you.
Oh, hi. Shivani, were you saying something?
I had something to ask related to the question. Yes, I have a question about the previous question. I wanted to add something.
Okay.
Is that possible? I thought.
Can you? Yeah, sure. We can start with Lewis and Shivani. Would you please mention it on the chat box? I will just request Jayashree to just pick that up and add. Is that fine with you, Shivani? I hope. Okay, thank you so much. Okay. Thank you. Yes.
I'm okay circling back. I'll answer this question and then I'll circle back. So this question I have gotten before. This is actually a question I've gotten before about different people coming from different, and actually, again, I think this just reveals binary logic, right? So should everybody do ace philosophy? No. Should some people do ace philosophy? Absolutely yes. Is it inconsistent with some people doing ace philosophy that you can have a nice table where an anthropologist sits down next to a historian, where the anthropologist only does anthropology and the historian only does historian? Okay, so no, it doesn't preclude that at all. Where did this idea come from? That's the first response. Second response is more important. We live in a world of increased knowledge production. Who is going to synthesize across all of these systems, right? Ace philosophers are people who are going to be trying to synthesize across systems. Of course, if everyone is a specialist and you bring all the specialists to the table, then you got a bunch of specialists talking past each other, as we have seen if you've ever been in an academic senate meeting. Basically like, oh, I'm sorry, I use the word knowledge this way and you mean it this way in science. Oh, how can we talk to each other? So if some people know a little bit about everything and don't know a lot about anything, they can sit not in the center of being important, but they can sit in the center navigating traffic. Someone's got to navigate traffic at the control. So I don't really this question has been pushed on me several times as if like I have some confused ideas, but I don't think that's it. I think the confusion is that a binary logic that says it's all or nothing is being pushed in the background as a way to simply show that my idea and theory doesn't have a lot of backing to it. But there's no reason to say everybody should do it. You can say some people do it, but in addition, and more importantly, I offer a solution to the problem of how people from different specializations can talk to each other. Think of Samba. How was it possible for a Sanskrit pundit to engage with someone at Oxford on the nature of propositions in meaning? How did they do it? It's because Arindam Chakrabarti actually knows Sanskrit and Oxford philosophy really well, and he could translate precisely and make the conversation possible. If you look at Sambad as a model for how an ace philosopher operates, I think you see the solution.
Okay. Okay. So Professor Shashi Motilal has asked this question. Is the waning interest in philosophy due to the fact that the methodology of doing philosophy has been wrong or inadequate? And will the ACE methodology bring back more interest in the subject?
Good. Yeah, so I think the waning interest in philosophy has nothing to do with the methodology. I think the waning interest has to do with the questions being asked. I think the questions that we are asking in philosophy right now are just not as important to people right now as they were in other time periods. But again, like so again, if I'm going to follow my own methodology, I would please like to see the statistics on the waning enrollments of philosophers in certain institutions. And I guarantee you one thing: there might be a relationship between the institution, its prestige, the socioeconomic relationship of the person able to attend that institution, and their interest in philosophy, and then we take it across different areas. So I don't know what's going on in philosophy. Does the University of Delhi philosophy department have less people interested in philosophy over the last 3 years? Does anybody know the answer?
Okay, we'll have to do an empirical study. I can't, not without evidence.
So that's relevant to me, because I think the waning interest to me is not methodological. I think ACE does make things more interesting. I will come out and say that. I think it speaks to a wider audience because it uses more methodologies that people are aware of. And also, by the way, I didn't spend a lot of time talking about phenomenology, which is also a methodology that can be used in the way in which I think about the term analytic, but phenomenology is actually extremely relevant also. So I think it's the questions partially that we're asking. If we ask different questions, maybe more students would be aware of that, be interested, but I don't think it's methodology alone. Yeah, I think mine is more interesting than others. Yeah.
Okay, we have had Leonard Walks giving us such nice insight throughout your conversation. Yeah. So I'm going to ask his question about what is your reaction to Tom Brooks, the paper in Metaphilosophy, Philosophy Unbound? If you have any opinion about it, or about Tom Brooks.
Can he say like 5 seconds what it means? I don't understand what it says. What does it say?
Okay, so maybe in case Leonard Fox is interested, please feel free to add that in, and I'll ask it again. Okay, so I'll just get to the next question till then. This is a question by Dr.
Probably you can ask him to. You can request him to ask live.
Can you unmute? He's right there.
Good. Can anybody hear me?
I can hear you, Leonard. Go.
Please.
Okay, good. So Tom Brooks' basic idea is that we've got to be talking to one another, but not trying to come to common conclusions or even common work, but rather learning from one another things that might be useful to us. So, for example, in a meeting of Western philosophers and Indian philosophers, and he's particularly interested in Indian philosophers. He's done most of his work with Indian philosophers. I do most of my work with Chinese philosophers. Mm-hmm. Tom does his work with Indian philosophers. And the idea is the Westerners don't go to these conferences to learn how to do Indian philosophy or to contribute to some kind of Indio-Western synthesis, but to learn how to do Western philosophy better. So it's like their aim should be just to do their own work well.
Oh, okay. And so what do I think of that idea? Well, I don't think that's a new idea. I think that that's somebody trying to present something that's already out there, because when I go and listen to another philosopher, oftentimes, no matter what they're saying, I think about how I can learn from them. I mean, that's a basic idea as a philosopher, is that I don't walk around arrogant in the world thinking I know everything. I think to myself, hey, what can this person teach me? And maybe what this person teaches me improves my own thinking about something, and maybe it doesn't. So I don't see what this, I mean, I would think the basic education of a philosopher is learn to be skeptical to the degree in which you're respectful, but also learn to learn from other people. I mean, I think Wittgenstein actually said in a very important passage, when two philosophers meet, the first thing they should say to each other is, how can I help you about? That's a very insightful comment, because that idea is basically core to my identity. It's like when I meet another philosopher, it's not like, how can I bash you into the ground? It's how can I learn from you? And yes, if I just put on the word, how can I learn from you to do what I want to do better, then I think I have his idea. So I'm not sure what's really new. I mean, I think, and again, it's dichotomous thinking. I don't think that every time we're doing philosophy, we have to be doing what he's saying. It's just sometimes we should be doing what he's saying, and other times other things. Why is the background logic of so many of these questions that come out so dichotomous all the time? In different contexts, a philosopher wants to do different things. Sometimes I want to inspire a person or people to rise up in a movement of activism the way Gandhi did. I mean, a lot of what he did as philosophical wasn't by some deep analysis from Pramana-shastra. It was about inspiration, or same with people like Ambedkar. So I think a lot of what we should think about is, what is the act of philosophizing doing in the given moment? And so I like the idea in the sense that I definitely will support it, what he's saying. But for me, it sounds a little bit basic, that like the first thing I would think is, how can I learn? So if a Western philosopher comes to India, I would hope that they're thinking, what can I learn from these people, whether or not it helps my own philosophy. And if it does help my own philosophizing, that's great. And one final thing on this, if you look at the paper I mentioned by Jay Shaw in the book Concepts of Knowledge, East and West, my claim basically is that had these people read that paper, they would have learned something about how to do their own study better back in 2001, right? Had they read the history of Indian philosophy a little bit, instead of just looking at social psychology, they might have actually done a better experiment the first time around. That's part of my claim. Does that help, Leonard?
Well, I think that you kind of box Tom Brooks in just a little bit. He's really not thinking about an individual philosopher. He's thinking about the global philosophical project. And I think he's quite right to think that it could be quite misdirected if we think we are moving toward some kind of global philosophical synthesis, and that the emphasis on maintaining distinction and doing our own work well is, I'm not saying, I don't know if even I support that, but I think it's a very distinct view, rather than, a kind of working towards some eclectic perennial philosophy. So
is the synthesizing, so right, so you did the individual versus group distinction, which I like. I think that helps a lot. So the idea is that, but again, it seems like we didn't seem to have the background condition drop. Why can't some philosophers be synthesizing and others not be synthesizing? Does that make sense, Leonard? Why can't some people be doing what he's doing and other people, I mean, doesn't this distinction collapse? Because if some people are ace philosophers and they're doing it well, and some people are just doing analytic metaphysics a la grounding well, then everything's fine. We're still doing, I mean, why can't ace philosophers?
Well, I guess, yeah. So I think Brooks' point is, and here I completely agree, that they could learn to do it better by having a more a kind of open border conception of what they're doing, and being not just willing to take on board the things that philosophers and other traditions are saying, but actually to reflect deeply about them and think, how does that really add to my toolkit? How can I think bigger? How can I think better about what I'm doing after these dialogues?
Yeah, so there's a little bit of that, which I think is also correct. I agree. So if you take the part about how can I do things better by adding these tools, that's a good example of, again, what actually Jay Shaw does in his Navya Nyaya analysis of the Gettier problem, because he shows that the tools of Navya Nyaya can be used to solve the Gettier problem, not just to say that we as Indian philosophers don't have that problem. It actually uses the tools specifically from the Navya Nyaya tradition to solve it. So that's a toolkit adding version. So I think the toolkit thing is there. I mean, I guess the one part I do see of what you're saying that's insightfully different about what he wants to propose is that if too many philosophers are driving towards this movement of a global synthesis, that could be the wrong way to go, because what might be better is if some people or a lot more people focus just on doing what they want to do better by listening to other people. So I think that's what he's talking about. I guess it's hard for me to see myself in that frame because I don't operate in that frame anyway. I don't see myself as promoting everyone doing this philosophy, or do I promote myself promoting everyone leaving behind what they're doing. I think what I'm saying is that this is also a viable project, and I think some people might like it, and I think it's helpful too, and I think people can become better at it and worse at it, and by listening to other philosophers. Like, I spend time with people who don't do this. I spend time with people who only do analytic metaphysics, only do analytic philosophy of mind, only do experimental philosophy, and I try to learn from them to do what I want to do better. So I think I'm doing what he's doing a little bit. That's my try. I should read. What's the paper called?
It's called Philosophy Unbound,
Okay.
and it's in.
Okay. It's in meta philosophy, correct?
Okay.
Okay.
I think I lost in between. I'm not sure. Okay. So, okay, Professor Bala, should I continue the next questions?
Please go ahead. Yeah.
Right. So the next question is by Dr. Aisha. So she said that she says that you talked about the possibility of having fusion epistemology, whereby one can probably merge analytic epistemology with folk epistemology. So how plausible is it to have that sort of fusion, given the fact that there are apparent differences in their frameworks, like concepts like true conduciveness, certitude, and justification, which are sort of focal points of analytic epistemology, are hardly of concern in evolutionary psychology?
Sorry. So there was, I lost the thread of the question because there was something about fusion and folk.
Yeah, folk epistemology and analytic epistemology. So we were talking about fusing them together. So can we do that, given that they have very different concepts?
No, I would think that the word folk epistemology is used the way the word folk physics is used. Folk physics is used to talk about how people who don't know the details of contemporary physics might track the trajectory of an object, like they're throwing a baseball. What are the principles they might use? How much force do I want to put in my arm as I release the ball? Or how does the cricketer, before they're highly trained, want to spin the ball? That's a folk physics. Folk physics means it's not the actual physics, it's the best physics we know right now. It's what people in their mind, before they've studied physics, might use to intuitively track objects, think about falling down. And so folk epistemology, I would think, is a term that's used, when you see the word folk, as I understand it, is used to refer to something like what's done prior to theorizing at a high level and academically debating it. So I wasn't proposing that we merge folk epistemology with analytic epistemology, because folk epistemology is not even a discipline. It's a way of talking about a group of people who have certain cognitive abilities, employing epistemic concepts not theoretically thought out that much. Like, how do I attribute no in a folk way? That's different. So we're not fusing that. Here's an example of fusion, though, if you want. So suppose I'm right now working on this myself. So what I've been thinking about is a theory of certification. And certification is a concept that is translated from Gangesha, a Navya Nyaya philosopher, and it's used to talk about a procedure that's done in debate contexts. And so in Western analytic philosophy, we have the concepts of warrant, entitlement, and justification. These are very key concepts of concern and analysis amongst analytic epistemologists. And so what I'm trying to do is fuse together a concept of certification based on the Navya Nyaya philosopher Gangesha, as well as analytic epistemology, for a new purpose, to give a new theory of public knowledge. So the idea is to give an account of public knowledge that's focused on the concept of certified knowledge versus uncertified knowledge. So the distinction I want to draw is a distinction by saying that knowledge doesn't analyze into having a component of justification, but knowledge can be certified in a context and uncertified in another context. and that the concept of certified and uncertified knowledge can serve our public good very well. How can it do it, right? Suppose we're having a debate in a democratic process about voting with respect to climate change. We might want to say to someone, hey, you might know something, but it's not certified in this context that you know that. And what's relevant to this democratic process is whether or not your knowledge is certified in this context. So contextual certification can be a way of talking about a concept that's useful for saying that people might know something, they know something, but that their knowledge is not relevant in a certain context. It's a way of blocking the, hey, you don't have a right to tell me I don't know because maybe I have definite mechanisms. So classical Indian philosophers are in this game all the time. The Pramana theorists debate each other all the time. Hey, I don't think that Upamana is a way of knowing. I don't think that Arthapati is a way of knowing. And the other person's like, I only think you can know by inference, or you can know by pratyaksha. So these debates are already there in Indian philosophy. And then we might carve out from studying them this idea of public knowledge for everybody to think about. And the key distinction I'm working on is the distinction between certified and uncertified knowledge, where knowledge is not contextual, knowledge is invariant, but certification is variant across context. And why is that useful? Because it helps us adjudicate debates and democratic processes in a different way. That's one example I would think of. So that's an example of fusion philosophy done through conceptual engineering in the style I like. But the beginning of this question was about folk epistemology fusing with analytic. I don't think that's not something in my mind, because I don't see how folk epistemology isn't the kind of thing that does fuse. Yeah.
Okay. I hope that addresses your question, Dr. Aisha. And so the next question is by Yogeshwar and Ravi Doughton. They've asked for, can you give some examples of successful instances of public to philosophy direction, other than your sort of collection of intuitions based on thought experiments or through surveys?
Right, good. So I think that there is a poverty of these examples, and there's two reasons for that. One, I have not seen another philosopher, although I haven't read everybody, obviously, who has made this distinction the way I have made it. So that's one thing. But that doesn't mean that there isn't anybody who falls under it, right? Because now once you draw a distinction, you can go look out and you can say these people fall under it. So I'm interested in the idea that some of the work that Angela Davis does actually does fall under the public to philosophy direction of fit. That was one of the inspirations for the research I did here, is I was paying attention to Angela Davis and reading her book, Are Prisons Obsolete? And I was like, wait a minute, this seems like she went out and paid attention to a problem in the world and asked a philosophical question. It's obviously a very poignant philosophical question, are prisons obsolete? And so I haven't talked to her yet, but I plan at some point on getting a conversation with her and asking her whether or not she thinks that her work would fall under this direction, because she clearly didn't go into it thinking, hey, here's all the classical theories of punishment we study in a class on philosophy of punishment. Now let's go see if prisons are obsolete. That's not what she did. She obviously did a lot more historical work on things and a lot more ground level work inquiring into the nature of something going on in our world. I think in some ways, another way to look at public to philosophy direction of fit is through the idea of philosophical journalism. That's another concept that I've been exploring. The idea that there's a kind of philosophical journalism, the way we do investigative journalism, but now imagine that an investigative journalist has the tools of a trained philosopher from various traditions. And that's to me, that's a very attractive job to have. If you wanted to be if I could start a new profession, it'd be the job of philosophical journalist. I think a lot of journalists are philosophically trained, but philosophical journalism seems really attractive to a lot of people. They don't want to just be writing academic articles. They want to be writing articles that engage people in the world, but they're philosophically guided. So I was influenced by a journalist who wrote an article about debate norms in what we had in the United States of America. We have something called the Ethics Bowl, where kids get together, they debate ethics cases. And she wrote a paper about the norms of ethics debates. And when she wrote this paper, as a journalist who didn't know much about philosophy at all, but knew a little bit about critical theory, she kind of just was like, well, what are the norms that guide ethical debate, and how should we think about those? And when she asked that, I was like, that's interesting. Do those norms also exist in critical thinking education? Are they there? And I found that they are there all over the place, and that now led to a long-standing 10-year project where I write every 2 years a paper on critical thinking from a different tradition in order to build out how different traditions of critical thinking explore the normativity of how critical thinking is done. If you look at the classical Indian Nyaya Shastras on how debate is done in India, they don't look exactly the same as what you find in Western. And also the fallacy lists are different. Some of the fallacies aren't the same. So it's kind of interesting to look at this. That was an example of, for me, public to philosophy direct. Someone in the public informed me of a problem that I went and did research in my discipline. But I would say philosophical journalism is another way to think about it. Yeah.
Okay. Hey, can you, Dr. Vaidya, can you repeat the name of the person who wrote the Norms of Ethics Balls?
You know, I can try and find it and send it to you. I have the name is Jessica Kraft, Kraft, Jessica Kraft. It's about hacking the ethics bull. I forgot the name of the title. Hacking the ethics bull. Yeah, but it's just a short piece about ethics bull debate norms. Yeah.
And okay, so the next question is by Shivani and Jayashree, and they ask about, even if we could differentiate and have a culture-sensitive, multidisciplinary public philosophy, then how viable is it to do public philosophy within academics? Because this would yet again sort of include the selection of certain questions as important, which would be published in journals, presented in academically powerful institutions. So the ranking problem could re-emerge here. What do you think? Is this a possibility?
Yes, it is. Actually, it is. And actually, I think the answer to that's a very important question, because I think you have to look at how academics engage in retention, tenure, and promotion. That's right. How do you become a tenured full professor at a university? And you don't want the problems that are in the proposal to cause problems in academia. So again, I think the answer to this, though, is pretty straightforward. I think the idea is something like this. Academic, and this actually, Leonard's question, part of what Leonard was saying is a good way to think about this in my book. So academics need to make sure that they are doing what they were trained to do really well, and that they're publishing in their discipline really well and following the norms of their discipline in order to get promoted up the train. But just because you do one thing doesn't mean you can't do something else. That's the other side. So I think that being a publicly engaged philosopher is something that one can do alongside the work they are doing in their own academic field. So we don't need to make another academic field. We can make public philosophy what it is. Whether or not a department wants to give someone credit for research they do in public philosophy and writing they want to do is more up to the university and the department. I'm in favor of it. Many people in my university do public philosophy in my department. In fact, one of them is a philosopher of chemistry. She does a lot of great work in public philosophy and ethics and philosophy of science. And it's wonderful. So we think it's really important that people do these things. We think it's great that people do these things. And we want to give credit to it. But I'm not going to tell Yale University to start giving people credit for public philosophy. I hope they would, but if they don't want to, that's up to them. My point is that the main thing is that being a public philosopher doesn't preclude you from doing work in your specific discipline. So I have specific work in the epistemology of modality, where that work is not mixed with any other tradition. It's purely pure all the way from the beginning, all the way out, studying theories of essence in analytic philosophy. And I still do that. I've been doing it for 25 years. I'll continue to do it for 25 years. But that stuff is not mixed with anything else. The other stuff that a public philosopher does, that's a separate thing.
Okay. Okay, so that's all the time we have had, and we have some questions which are there, but I'm going to be just sharing the link to his website and to his institutional profile again, and you guys can definitely drop him a mail.
Can I just say one thing also?
Yeah, yes, please.
Quickly. If there are a lot of questions that showed up that obviously we didn't get to, so my suggestion is that if you want to email me the questions, I can probably sit down one day and bang out some answers to them short. I mean, if there's too many, I won't be able to do it, but I can also point you to other literature. I'm happy to do that. And if you give me more time, I eventually will get to them. But I'm sorry I couldn't get to all of them, but there's only limited time. Yeah.
Okay, Professor Bala, would you like to take over? Thank you so much, Dr. Anand.
Yeah, thank you so much, Anand, for this wonderful presentation, as well as the interaction that you had with our audience today. And most of the questions that you have answered are from our research scholars who have come together and who had a separate meeting, and they discussed and they deliberated on whatever you have sent, the article that you have sent, and it was wonderful that they came up with interesting questions, and you also interacted with them and tried to to respond to them.
Real
I'm sure
quickly, this book came out recently. It has the continuation paper of the next one that came out in the series. So if you want to discuss another